Welcome to this online lecture for Western Civ 2. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most important ideas of the 19th century. That idea is, of course, liberalism. Now, as always, there are some key terms that you should be able to identify by the time this lecture is over, as well as some questions you should be able to answer at the end of the lecture as well. So let's get to it. But before we talk about liberalism, we need to start by talking about some of the ancestors of liberalism. And truly, liberalism would not have existed without the Enlightenment. So we're going to start with the Enlightenment. Perhaps the best example of the ideas of the Enlightenment is the Declaration of the Rights of Man from the French Revolution. Here are just a few of the many points taken from that declaration. Again, there is the idea that people are born free and equal. Section 2 says that government's intent is to preserve human liberty. That's an idea right out of John Locke. Finally, point 3 agrees with Jefferson that sovereignty, or the right to rule, comes not from a king or a queen, but from the people. So if the Declaration of the Rights of Man was the pinnacle of the Enlightenment, then what happened? What happened to those ideas? This is what happened. First, there was the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. The Reign of Terror completely trampled on the ideas of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Few of the people executed during the Terror received fair trials, though their guilt was simply presumed. The speed with which the French Revolution began to disregard the ideas of the Enlightenment led many to argue that the common people simply could not be trusted with these rights. Only the most educated should rule. Moreover, the support for Napoleon, a ruler who also disregarded many of the ideas of the Enlightenment, seemed to confirm in the minds of many that the people simply could not be trusted to rule themselves. But despite the fact that many of the ideas of the Enlightenment were discredited by the French Revolution, the reality is the Enlightenment does not go away. Instead, the ideas continue to percolate among Europe's intellectuals. These ideas came to be known as liberalism. Now, what did people mean when they talked about liberalism in the 19th century? The most popular definition is this notion that it's a philosophy that preaches the freedom from economic and government restraint. Let me repeat that one more time. Liberalism, at least in a classical sense, meant freedom from economic and government restraint. Liberalism came to be associated with a number of rights, including broader voting rights, constitutional government, freedom of speech or press, the freedom of religion, and so on and so forth. Now, what do all these ideas have in common? Well, each one represents a belief in a limited role for government in the lives of the people. But in reality, liberals were only willing to go so far. Most, not all, liberals limited their belief in voting rights to men who owned property. That excluded both women and the poor. But liberalism is about more than government. Liberals also had something to say about the economy. One of the most prominent economic liberals was Adam Smith, who published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. In it, he argued that government should not interfere in economic matters. Instead, the market should be allowed to govern itself. This idea came to be known as laissez-faire, or hands-off economics. Essentially, the idea argued that the laws of supply and demand should be the only regulators of the economy. The government should not interfere at all. Thus, in a nutshell, here were the basic ideas of liberalism as they stood in 1848. There was a demand for popular government, in other words, greater voting rights, giving people more of a say in their government. There were protections for human rights, things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. There was also constitutional government, the idea that a government should not be unlimited in its power, but instead should have its powers written down. There should be no more absolutist government. There is also, in addition, I should have had it on the slide, but there's also economic liberalism as discussed by Adam Smith in one of the previous slides. Now, just to give you some perspective on where we're going with this, just think, just be aware that it's these ideas, the ones that are on the screen right now, that are going to touch off a revolution and topple yet another French king. But that's a story for a future lecture.